Welcome, friend, to a quiet corner of the past, where the lamplight casts a dim glow and the smoldering embers whisper ancient tales. Tonight, we'll journey to a land once ruled by emperors and poets, a realm where beauty bloomed in the shadow of impending change. Imagine yourself here, listening to the soft scrape of a brush on thick parchment as we delve into the extraordinary saga of Feudal Japan, a story that will reshape your understanding of power, loyalty, and the unyielding human spirit. Let's dim the lights a bit more, shall we? The air is frostbitten outside, but here, the warmth of history will keep you company. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support means the world. Also, do me a favor and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to get a sense of who else is out there, maybe feeling a little bit of a chill themselves. Picture it, the deepest hour before dawn, a time when the world feels suspended between slumber and awakening. You're standing on damp earth, the morning mist curling across fields where rice stalks, heavy with dew, bend in the gentle breeze. The only sounds are the rustling reeds nearby and the hollow thud of hooves. And then he emerges, a lone horseman, a dark silhouette against the faint promise of sunrise. His steed, a sturdy warhorse, moves with quiet purpose, its breath pluming in the crisp, cold air. The rider sits straight and tall, his dark armor gleaming with moisture, catching the first pale light of dawn. A curved sword, its cold metal biting your skin as he passes, rests at his side. He is a man of the provinces, forged in a different crucible than the silk-robed nobles of the distant capital. Behind him, barely visible through the thick fog, the peaked roofs of a distant temple emerged like islands in a gray, ethereal sea. This is Japan, in the year 1180. A land balanced on the very edge of transformation, where an ancient world is about to give way to something entirely new. The age of the warrior, our samurai rider, his movements deliberate, his face set, carries news that will reshape a nation. He bears word that Prince Mokihito, a son of the current emperor, has called upon the scattered Minamoto clan to take up arms against the Taira, a family grown too powerful, too comfortable in their control of the imperial court. The message he carries, rolled in thick parchment and tied with coarse rope, is a spark. And that spark, my friend, will ignite a war that lasts for 5 long years and establish a new order that will endure for 7 centuries. What seems impossible eventually becomes the new normal. This moment, this single rider in the mist, marks the true beginning of feudal Japan. It's a turning point, a hinge in history, where the scales tip from courtly elegance to martial might. But to truly grasp how we arrived at this crossroads, you must step back with me, much further back, into an earlier time. To the twilight years of the Heian period, when Japan was ruled not by fierce warriors, but by poets and scholars who had never held a sword. A very different Japan indeed, almost serene in its ignorance of the coming storm. The year 1000 found Japan at the height of its classical age. Imagine yourself in the capital city of Kyoto, then called Heian-kyo. The imperial court here lived in splendid isolation, cushioned from the rough realities of provincial life. Here, in palaces built of unpainted wood, timber groaning softly with age, and surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens, nobles spent their days composing 31-syllable poems called **waka**. They arranged flowers with painstaking precision and participated in elaborate ceremonies that had been perfected over centuries. The emperor, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu according to Shinto belief, ruled in theory over all of Japan. But in practice, real power lay with the Fujiwara clan, who had, for 200 years, managed to marry their daughters to emperors and place their sons in key government positions. It was a clever, almost insidious way to maintain control without ever overtly seizing the throne. These were masters of courtly intrigue, weaving webs of influence and allegiance with delicate threads of silk and poetry. This was a world of exquisite refinement. Imagine court ladies, their faces painted white with rice powder, their teeth blackened in a process called asterisk, OHAGURO asterisk, a symbol of beauty at the time. They wore layered robes of silk in carefully chosen color combinations, each hue speaking volumes about their aesthetic sophistication. They communicated through poetry, exchanging delicate love letters written on specially selected paper, often scented with incense. Their worth was often judged by their ability to quote classical Chinese literature and their skill at playing the asterisk koto asterisk, a 13-stringed musical instrument whose plaintive melodies echoed through the palace corridors, carried on the wind, whispering through the eaves. The greatest literary achievement of this era was the Tale of Genji, written around 1010 by a court lady known as Murasaki Shikibu. This novel, often considered the world's first psychological novel, followed the romantic adventures of Prince Genji through a world of silk curtains, incense ceremonies, and moonlit garden parties. Yet, even as Murasaki wrote her masterpiece, she seemed acutely aware that this world of aesthetic perfection was fragile, built on foundations that were already beginning to crumble. Catastrophe forces opportunity, but first, it often demands a price. For beyond the elegant boundaries of the capital, Japan was quietly, irrevocably changing. The emperor's government, for all its ceremonial splendor and meticulous rituals, struggled to maintain control over the distant provinces. The system of public lands that had supported the central government was breaking down, piece by piece, as local strongmen carved out private estates called asterisk shuen. These shuen were often exempt from imperial taxation, a growing drain on the central treasury, weakening the very core of imperial power. These estates were often held by temples, powerful court nobles, or retired emperors. But even these powerful entities needed protection from bandits, rival claimants, and the general lawlessness that festered beyond the capital's refined walls. And that protection, my friend, came from men on horseback, men armed with bows and swords, who would eventually be known as samurai. The heavy silence that once permeated the countryside was slowly being replaced by the distant clanging of metal on metal. The word samurai comes from the Japanese verb asterisk, saburo, asterisk, meaning to serve. These early warriors were not yet the refined warrior poets of later centuries, the image you might hold in your mind. No, they were practical men, gritty and tough, who made their living through their skill with weapons. They served the great families of the provinces, the Minamoto in the east, the Taira in the west, and the Fujiwara, who had once held so much courtly sway, now extending their reach into the north. They protected their lords' lands and collected their rents, often with force. In exchange for their service, these early samurai received grants of land and the right to collect taxes from the peasants who worked those lands. Life for these warriors was hard and uncertain, far from the perfumed halls of Kyoto. They lived in fortified compounds, their homes designed for defense rather than comfort. surrounded by earthen walls and wooden palisades that creaked and groaned in the wind. Their days began before dawn with weapons practice, their training grounds echoing with the sound of wooden swords striking against each other and arrows thudding into straw targets. They learned to fight from horseback, using their primary weapon, the asymmetrical composite bow, to strike enemies at distances of up to 300 yards. This longbow, taller than a man, was a formidable instrument, requiring immense strength and years of practice. The curved sword, which would later become the iconic symbol of their class, was at this time still a secondary weapon, used mainly when an archer had exhausted his arrows or when fighting at close quarters. The coarse wool of their garments, the stiff leather of their saddles, the cold metal of their practice weapons. Survival teaches lessons money can't buy. These warriors followed a code of conduct that was still taking shape, drawing from Buddhist concepts of karma and duty, Confucian ideas about loyalty and hierarchy, and indigenous Japanese values of group solidarity and personal honor. They believed that their actions in this life would determine their fate in the next, and that dying honorably in service to their Lord was preferable to living in shame. This ethos, still nascent, provided a moral framework for men whose lives were defined by violence. This emerging warrior ethic was reinforced by the Buddhist temples that dotted the Japanese landscape. Here, monks not only provided spiritual guidance, but often served as administrators, teachers, and sometimes, surprisingly, as warriors themselves. The great monastery complexes, like Inryakuji on Mount Hiei and Kafukuji in Nara, maintained their own armies of warrior monks, called *sai. These monks fought to protect their institution's interests and territorial rights, a startling blend of spiritual devotion and martial might. These armed monks, with their distinctive *naginata* pole weapons and their heads shaved in the Buddhist fashion, were formidable opponents. They did not hesitate to march on the capital when their interests were threatened, their echoing footsteps a stark contrast to the quiet, scholarly life one might expect. Their very existence demonstrated how thoroughly the old Heian ideal of peaceful, aesthetic government had broken down. The stillness, once thick enough to touch in Kyoto, was now shattered by the very forces meant to embody peace. As the 11th century progressed, the balance of power in Japan shifted decisively. It moved away from the elegant, but ultimately ineffective, Fujiwara regents and toward the warrior families of the provinces. A series of conflicts, beginning with the earlier 9 Years' War in 1051 and continuing through the later 3 Years' War that ended in 1087, demonstrated that political power now lay with those who could command armed men rather than those who could compose elegant poetry. Traditional authority was being questioned brutally. The hero of these early conflicts was Minamoto no Yoshi, a warrior whose skill with the bow and his generous treatment of his followers earned him the unwavering loyalty of samurai throughout the eastern provinces. Yoshi understood that true leadership in this new age required more than just military prowess. It demanded the ability to inspire personal devotion through acts of courage and, crucially, generosity. His worn shoes scuffing frost on many a battleground, he learned how to rally men not just with commands, but with genuine care. After one particularly hard-fought battle, he used his own resources to reward his followers when the court failed to provide adequate compensation, creating bonds of loyalty that would benefit his descendants for generations. Meanwhile, in the western provinces, the Taira clan was building its own power base. Unlike the Minamoto, who remained focused on their eastern strongholds, the Taira developed close connections to the imperial court and, critically, to the lucrative trade routes that connected Japan to Song dynasty China. Taira ships carried Japanese gold, silver, and finely crafted goods across the treacherous waters of the East China Sea, returning with Chinese silk, spices, and books that commanded high prices in the Japanese market. This difference in orientation, the Minamoto as eastern, land-based warriors, the Taira as western, sea-trading courtiers, would eventually lead to their collision. But first, both clans would serve the imperial court in a series of conflicts that revealed the complete bankruptcy of the old Heian system. The quiet dread of what was to come lingered in the salty sea air. The crisis came in 1156 with the Hagen disturbance, a succession dispute within the imperial family that quickly drew in the major warrior clans. Retired Emperor Sutoku, supported by the head of the Fujiwara clan and parts of both Minamoto and Taira forces, challenged the authority of Emperor Go-Shirakawa, who had his own samurai supporters. The fighting was brief but decisive, lasting only a few hours on a single night in July, but its implications were enormous. For the first time, the outcome of an imperial succession had been determined by armed force rather than court intrigue. The aftermath of the Hagen disturbance saw Taira no Kiyomori emerge as the dominant figure in Japanese politics. This remarkable man combined military prowess with a sophisticated understanding of court intrigue, gradually building a network of power that extended from the imperial palace to the trading ports of the inland sea. Kiyomori understood that in this new age, success required the ability to operate in both worlds, the refined environment of the court and the rough-and-tumble world of provincial warfare. He moved with the smooth elegance of a courtier, yet the hardened resolve of a warrior. Under Kiyomori's leadership, the Taira clan reached heights of power and prosperity that would have seemed impossible to their ancestors. They controlled key positions in the imperial government, dominated the lucrative trade with Song China, and built a network of allies that stretched across the archipelago. Their success was built on a careful balance of military strength and political acumen, using force when necessary, but preferring to achieve their goals through negotiation and compromise. They were adept at pulling the strings of power, much like the Fujiwara before them, but with a sharp blade always at their side. The Taira capital, at Fukuhara, near modern-day Kobe, became a bustling symbol of their power and ambition. Here, Chinese merchants unloaded silk and spices, while Japanese traders loaded ships with gold, silver, and crafted goods. The harbor buzzed with activity, a cacophony of muffled chatter and creaking beams, as vessels prepared for the dangerous journey across the East China Sea, their holds filled with the products that would finance Taira dominance. The sound of hammers echoed from the shipyards, where craftsmen built the sturdy vessels needed for oceanic trade, while in the markets, merchants speaking Chinese, Korean, and various Japanese dialects haggled over prices and terms of payment. Entrepreneurial ambition was thriving. Yet, even as they prospered, the seeds of the Taira downfall were being planted in the distant provinces. There, the Minamoto clan nursed their grievances, biding their time and waiting for their opportunity. The Eastern warriors had never fully accepted Taira dominance, seeing them as court favorites who had forgotten their warrior origins, who had perhaps gone soft among the silk and spices. This resentment was carefully cultivated by Minamoto survivors who had escaped the purges that followed the Hagen and Heiji disturbances. men who waited in mountain strongholds and provincial temples for their chance at revenge. The opportunity came in 1180, when Prince Mokihito, a son of Emperor Go-Shirakawa, who had been passed over in the succession, issued a call for the Minamoto to take up arms against the Taira. The prince's appeal provided the crucial legal justification that the Minamoto needed, framing their rebellion not as mere clan warfare, but as a righteous effort to restore proper imperial authority. The document that our lone horseman carried through the morning mist was part of this larger call to arms, spreading the word that the time for revenge had finally come. The war that followed would be known as the Genpei War, taking its name from the alternate readings of the Chinese characters for Minamoto Gen and Tairapei. It was a conflict that would rage for 5 years, from 1180 to 1185, and would determine the future of Japanese governance for centuries to come. Unlike the brief palace coups of the previous generation, this was a true national conflict that drew in warriors from across the archipelago and was fought on battlefields from the northern island of Honshu to the southern waters around Kyushu. The quiet dread was about to explode into open warfare. The early phase of the war went badly for the Minamoto. Prince Mokihito was killed at the Battle of Yuji before he could effectively organize the rebellion, and the initial Minamoto uprisings were quickly suppressed by Taira forces. Many of the eastern warriors who had answered the call to arms found themselves trapped in hopeless positions, their castles surrounded by superior enemy forces. It seemed for a moment that the Taira had weathered the storm and would emerge stronger than ever, their red banners flying defiantly against the blue sky. But the Minamoto cause was saved by the emergence of two remarkable leaders, Minamoto no Yoritomo, who established himself in the strategic town of Kamakura and began to build a coherent political organization, and his younger half-brother, Yoshitsune, whose tactical genius and personal charisma made him the most effective field commander of the war, while Yoritomo worked methodically to unite the eastern provinces under his banner. Yoshitsune led lightning campaigns that struck at Taira strongholds across central and western Japan. These moments linger longer than the years that follow. The contrast between the two brothers reflected different aspects of successful leadership in the new warrior age. Yoritomo was a politician and administrator, a man who understood that lasting victory required not just military success, but the creation of institutions that could maintain order and command loyalty. He spent long hours in his Kamakura headquarters, the only sound the soft rustling of thick parchment as he worked, carefully negotiating with local strongmen, confirming land grants, and building the administrative apparatus that would eventually become Japan's first shogunate. Yoshitsune, by contrast, was a warrior, pure and simpler man, whose very presence on the battlefield could inspire his followers and demoralize his enemies. His most famous victory came at the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani in 1184, where he led a surprise cavalry charge down a steep cliff that the Taira had considered impossible to descend. The attack came at dawn, just as the morning mist was lifting from the beach where the Taira had made their camp, and the thundering of hooves and the war cries of the attacking samurai shattered the morning quiet like a sudden thunderstorm. The Taira forces, caught completely off guard, fled to their ships in panic, abandoning their weapons and supplies in their haste to escape. The image of proud warriors wading into the surf in their heavy armor, desperately trying to reach the safety of their vessels while arrows rained down around them, became one of the defining scenes of the war. It demonstrated that traditional military thinking was no longer sufficient in an age when innovative tactics and bold leadership could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Hard work and clever thinking reshape outcomes. As the war progressed, the character of Japanese warfare itself began to change. The individual combat that had characterized earlier conflicts, with warriors calling out challenges and fighting single duels while their armies watched, gave way to coordinated unit tactics designed to achieve decisive results. The introduction of mass archery, synchronized cavalry charges, and siege warfare marked the beginning of a more systematic approach to military operations that would continue to evolve throughout the medieval period. The sharp crack of arrows flying in unison, the thunder of 100 hooves, this was a new kind of terror. The Genpei War was fought across a landscape of extraordinary beauty and strategic complexity. The mountainous terrain of central Japan, with its narrow valleys and rushing rivers, favored defensive tactics and made large-scale troop movements difficult. Battles were often decided by the side that could seize and hold key mountain passes or river crossings, forcing their enemies to attack uphill or across open water, where they would be vulnerable to archery fire. The damp earth underfoot, the wind whispering secrets through the trees, all became part of the deadly game. The inland sea, with its hundreds of islands and hidden coves, became a theater of naval warfare as both sides sought to control the vital shipping routes that connected the different regions of the archipelago. The Taira, with their long experience in maritime trade, initially held the advantage in these waters, but the Ming gradually built up their own naval capabilities by allying with local fishing communities and pirate bands who knew every current and tide in the region. These ordinary people, previously overlooked, were now empowered, their knowledge of the sea invaluable. The warriors who fought in this conflict were masters of mounted archery, their primary tactical system based on the individual combat skills of heavily armed cavalry. A typical samurai of this period rode to battle on a specially trained warhorse, his body protected by elaborate armor made of iron and leather plates bound together with silk cords. This armor, known as *jijiroi, was designed to provide maximum protection while allowing the freedom of movement necessary for archery. The plates were often decorated with family crests and religious symbols, turning each warrior into a mobile work of art that proclaimed his identity and allegiances. The samurai's primary weapon was the bow, an asymmetrical composite construction made of bamboo, wood, and sinew that could drive an arrow through armor at considerable distance. These bows, known as *yumi*, were nearly 7 feet long and required tremendous strength and skill to use effectively. The arrows themselves were carefully crafted objects, with points designed for different purposes, some for piercing armor, others for starting fires, still others for sending messages across the battlefield. The hollow thuds of practice arrows were now replaced by the deadly whistle of war. The curved sword, though already present, was still considered a secondary weapon, used primarily when the archer had exhausted his arrows or when fighting at close quarters. These early *tachi* were longer and more curved than the *katana* that would become famous in later periods, designed to be worn edge down from a belt rather than thrust through the sash. The forging of these swords was already an art form, with master smiths creating blades that combined cutting ability with aesthetic beauty, their surfaces displaying the distinctive grain patterns that resulted from the complex folding and heating processes used in their creation. Cold metal biting your skin, yet beautiful. The conduct of warfare in the Genpei period was governed by elaborate codes of honor that emphasized individual prowess and proper behavior. Before a battle, champions from each side would often engage in single combat, their deeds witnessed and recorded by poets and chroniclers who accompanied the armies. These individual duels were not mere displays of martial skill, but crucial tests of morale and divine favor, their outcomes often determining the course of larger engagements. The quiet dread of waiting for such a duel, the heavy silence, was almost unbearable. A typical challenge would begin with a warrior riding out from his army to a position visible to both sides, where he would announce his name, lineage, and previous accomplishments before calling for an opponent worthy of his steel. The ensuing combat would be fought according to strict rules that governed everything from the types of weapons that could be used to the proper treatment of a defeated enemy. Victory brought great honor not only to the individual warrior, but to his entire family and clan. History isn't written in stone. It's written in footsteps like yours. The ritualized nature of combat reflected the deep spiritual significance that warriors attached to their profession, viewing each battle as a test of their karma and their worthiness to serve. Buddhist concepts of impermanence and the cycle of death and rebirth provided a framework for understanding the risks of their calling, while Shinto beliefs about the protective power of ancestral spirits offered comfort in times of danger. These philosophical underpinnings helped them face the harsh realities of their violent lives, providing a sense of purpose even in the midst of savagery. The most famous engagement of the Genpei War was the Battle of Dan Nuera, fought in 1185 in the straits between Honshu and Kyushu. This naval battle represented the culmination of years of conflict, with the Taira fleet making its final stand against the combined forces of the Minamoto and their allies. The narrow waters of the strait, where powerful tidal currents created treacherous sailing conditions, had been chosen by the Taira as a place where their superior seamanship might give them an advantage over their land-based enemies. The wind howled through the sails, a mournful dirge for the coming conflict. The battle began at dawn on a calm spring day, with both fleets arranged in traditional formation across the narrow strait. The Taira ships, their hulls decorated with red banners that gave them the appearance of floating temples, carried the child emperor Antoku and the sacred regalia that symbolized imperial authority. The Minamoto fleet, flying white banners that stood out starkly against the blue water, was larger but less experienced in naval warfare. For several hours, the fighting proceeded according to traditional patterns, with individual warriors leaping between ships to engage in personal combat, while archers from both sides filled the air with arrows. The Taira seemed to have an upper hand, their experienced sailors maneuvering their vessels with skill and precision, while their warriors fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant extinction. But the tide, both literal and metaphorical, began to turn against the Taira as the day progressed. The crucial moment came when a prominent Taira ally, knowing the local currents and having lost faith in his side's chances, switched sides and revealed to the Minamoto the location of the ship carrying the child emperor. The betrayal was devastating, giving the Minamoto forces a clear target for their final assault. As Minamoto arrows began to find their marks on the imperial ship, the Taira leadership faced the ultimate test of their warrior code. Rather than submit to capture and humiliation, they chose to embrace death with honor. The emperor's grandmother, Taira no Tokuko, took the 8-year-old Ontoku in her arms and leaped into the dark waters of the strait, choosing death over surrender. One by one, the other Taira leaders followed suit, their bodies dragging down by the weight of their armor as they sank beneath the waves. The stillness that followed was thick enough to touch, heavy with tragedy. The destruction of the Taira fleet at Dan-Nura marked the end of the first great samurai conflict and the beginning of a new era in Japanese history. The Minamoto victory was complete and devastating, their rivals as a political force and establishing the principle that military might would henceforth determine political authority. Yet the triumph came at a terrible cost, as the flower of the warrior class had been decimated in the fighting, and the old certainties of court-centered governance had been shattered beyond repair. Catastrophe reshaped society, opening doors for opportunities that didn't exist before. The aftermath of the Genpei War saw the rapid consolidation of Minamoto power under Yoritomo's leadership. From his headquarters in Kamakura, far from the traditional centers of imperial authority, he began to construct a new system of governance that would eventually be known as the shogunate. This was not a revolutionary overthrow of the existing order, but rather a careful rebalancing of power that maintained the forms of imperial rule while transferring real authority to military leaders. The Kamakura system, as it came to be known, was based on the principle of feudal loyalty, with warriors at all levels bound together by oaths of mutual obligation and service. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the shogun, who ruled in the name of the emperor, but derived his authority from the loyalty of his vassal warriors. Below him were the provincial governors and military commanders, who administered the various regions of the archipelago, each responsible for maintaining order and collecting taxes within their assigned territories. This feudal system was remarkably flexible and durable, capable of adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The key to its success lay in the personal bonds between lord and vassal relationships that were cemented by elaborate ceremonies and reinforced by constant interaction. A samurai's loyalty to his lord was not merely a matter of legal obligation, but a sacred trust that defined his identity and his place in the world. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate marked the beginning of what historians call the medieval period in Japanese history, a time when warrior values and institutions would dominate the political landscape. Yet this transition was not accomplished without significant challenges and setbacks. Yoritomo's own brothers, Yoshitsune and Noriyori, who had played crucial roles in the Taira defeat, became sources of suspicion and eventually fell victim to their older brother's paranoia. The elimination of these potential rivals strengthened Yoritomo's position, but also demonstrated the brutal pragmatism that would characterize medieval Japanese politics. Yoshitsuno, the hero of Ichi no Tower, was hunted like a criminal across the mountains of northern Honshu before finally dying by his own hand in a remote stronghold. His death became the subject of countless poems and plays, transforming him into a tragic figure whose fate illustrated the costs of political success in the warrior age. You might need a moment to adjust to this brutal reality. The new capital at Kamakura reflected the practical, military-focused nature of the shogunate. Unlike the elaborate palaces and gardens of Kyoto, Kamakura was a working city. Its streets filled with the sounds of armor-smiths and swordsmiths, the distant clanging of metal on metal, a constant backdrop. Its buildings were designed for function rather than beauty. The shogun's residence, while impressive, was essentially a fortified compound that could be defended against attack. The city's layout reflected military priorities, with key roads and intersections controlled by loyal retainers and potential escape routes carefully planned. Yet even as the warriors consolidated their political dominance, they recognized the need to maintain cultural and religious continuity with the past. The Kamakura period saw a remarkable flowering of Buddhist art and architecture, as the new rulers sought to legitimize their authority through patronage of religious institutions. The great bronze Buddha of Kamakura, cast in the mid-13th century, became a symbol of this synthesis between military power and spiritual authority. Its serene countenance, gazing out over a world transformed by war, but still anchored in eternal truths. The Buddhism that flourished under the early Kamakura shogunate was increasingly adapted to the needs and concerns of the warrior class. New schools of Buddhist thought emerged that emphasized practical wisdom and direct experience over scholarly study and ritual complexity. The Zen tradition, which had been introduced from China in the late 12th century, proved particularly appealing to samurai, with its emphasis on discipline, meditation, and the cultivation of inner strength. These were practical guidance for difficult lives. Zen temples became centers of warrior culture, where military leaders came to study strategy, practice calligraphy, and seek spiritual guidance. The famous rock garden of Ryoanji, though created in a later period, represents the aesthetic sensibility that emerged from this synthesis of Zen spirituality and warrior culture. Its spare beauty, reflecting the discipline and restraint that characterized the samurai ideal. The dust-softened light filtering through the paper screens in these quiet rooms invited contemplation. The relationship between Buddhism and warrior culture was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, Buddhist teachings about compassion and non-violence seemed to conflict with the samurai's profession of arms. On the other hand, the Buddhist concept of karma provided a framework for understanding the moral implications of warfare, while the ideal of selfless service offered a way to reconcile the warrior's duty with spiritual development. Many samurai found in Buddhism a source of strength and consolation that helped them face the dangers and moral ambiguities of their calling. The practice of meditation became an integral part of military training, helping warriors develop the mental discipline and emotional control necessary for success in battle. The acceptance of death as a natural part of existence, central to Buddhist teaching, provided comfort to men whose profession constantly exposed them to mortal danger. Even in chaos, small routines keep you human, and meditation was one such routine. The early Kamakura period also saw significant developments in Japanese law and administration. The new warrior government needed to establish clear rules for the conduct of its vassals and the administration of its territories. The J.J. Code, promulgated in 1232, represented the first systematic attempt to codify the customs and practices of warrior society. This legal framework established principles for the inheritance of military positions, the duties of vassals to their lords, and the procedures for resolving disputes within the warrior class. The daily life of a samurai in the early Kamakura period was structured around the twin demands of military service and estate management. A typical day began before dawn, with physical training and weapons practice activities that were considered essential for maintaining the skills and discipline required of a warrior. The morning exercises might include archery practice, mounted combat training, and the study of military strategy and tactics. The training regimen was rigorous and unforgiving. Young samurai learned to draw their bows while galloping at full speed, hitting targets no larger than a fan at distances of over 200 yards. They practiced sword techniques thousands of times until the movements became instinctive, their bodies responding without conscious thought to the presence of danger. The philosophy behind this training was that in actual combat there would be no time for hesitation or deliberation. Victory would go to the warrior whose training had been so thorough that his responses were automatic. The wooden handles, smooth from years of use, spoke of endless repetition. After the morning training, the samurai would turn to the administrative duties required to maintain his estate and support his military service. This might involve supervising agricultural work, collecting taxes from tenant farmers, settling disputes between villages, or corresponding with other members of his lord's administration. The samurai of this period were not merely professional soldiers, but also landowners and administrators responsible for the economic and social welfare of the communities under their control. The management of a samurai estate required a complex understanding of agricultural cycles, weather patterns, and market conditions. Rice was the foundation of the economy, and the successful cultivation of this crop demanded careful attention to irrigation, fertilization, and pest control. The samurai had to ensure that his peasants had the tools and knowledge necessary to maximize production, while also setting aside sufficient stores to survive poor harvests and natural disasters. This blend of martial and managerial skills was crucial. The samurai household was a complex institution that combined military, economic, and social functions. The warrior's wife and daughters played crucial roles in this system, managing domestic affairs, supervising the education of children, and maintaining the cultural traditions that defined their class. Samurai women were expected to be skilled in the traditional arts of poetry, music, and calligraphy, but they were also taught to handle weapons and to defend their homes when necessary. They moved with quiet strength, their hands as adept with a brush as with a blade. The education of young samurai was a carefully structured process that began in early childhood and continued throughout their lives. Boys learned to read and write using Chinese characters, studied the classics of Confucian and Buddhist literature, and received instruction in military strategy and tactics. They were taught to ride horses and handle weapons, but they were also expected to master the cultural accomplishments that marked them as members of the educated elite. The lantern gold shadows in their study rooms held tales of both valor and verse. The curriculum included the study of history, particularly the military campaigns and heroic deeds of famous warriors from the past. These stories served not only as entertainment, but as moral instruction, providing examples of proper conduct and inspiring young samurai to live up to the standards set by their predecessors. The tale of the hike, which recounted the rise and fall of the Taira clan, became a central text in samurai education. Its combination of military action and Buddhist philosophy perfectly suited to the warrior worldview. Physical education was equally important. Young samurai learned to swim in full armor, to scale walls and cliffs, and to move silently through forests and across open ground. They were taught to read the signs of weather and season, to navigate by the stars, and to survive in the wilderness with minimal equipment. These skills were not merely practical necessities, but were seen as essential elements of warrior character, demonstrating the self-reliance and adaptability that distinguished the true samurai. Survival teaches lessons money can't buy, indeed. The religious life of the Kamakura period was characterized by both continuity and innovation. The great temples and monasteries that had been established during the Nara and Heian periods continued to play important roles in Japanese society, serving as centers of learning, art, and spiritual guidance. At the same time, new forms of Buddhist practice emerged that were better suited to the needs of the warrior class and the common people. The Pure Land schools, which emphasized faith in the saving power of Amida Buddha, gained widespread popularity among all social classes. This form of Buddhism offered the promise of salvation through simple faith rather than complex philosophical understanding, making it accessible to illiterate peasants and busy warriors alike. The recitation of the asterisk Nimbutsu, asterisk the phrase, asterisk Namu Amida Butsu, asterisk I take refuge in Amida Buddha, became a common practice that could be performed anywhere and at any time. The Zen tradition attracted the patronage of military leaders who found its emphasis on direct experience and practical wisdom particularly appealing. Zen temples became centers of a distinctive warrior culture that would influence Japanese society for centuries to come. These institutions combined religious practice with military training, scholarly study with practical skills, and aesthetic refinement with martial discipline. The economic foundation of the Kamakura system was agriculture, specifically the cultivation of rice in the paddies that covered much of the Japanese archipelago. The Shuen system, which had emerged during the Heian period, continued to be the primary means of organizing agricultural production, though it was now more tightly controlled by the warrior government. The samurai who held these estates were responsible for maintaining the irrigation systems, supervising the planting and harvesting of crops, and collecting the taxes that supported the military establishment. The relationship between the warrior class and the peasantry was complex and varied considerably from region to region. In some areas, the samurai lived among the farmers they governed, participating directly in the agricultural cycle and sharing in the risks and rewards of cultivation. In others, they maintained their residences in fortified compounds and exercised their authority through bailiffs and administrators. Regardless of the specific arrangements, the system depended on the productivity of the peasant farmers, whose labor provided the surplus that supported the warrior elite. Ordinary people now dreamed bigger than before, even if their freedom was limited. The technological innovations of the Kamakura period reflected the practical needs of both military and agricultural life. Improvements in metallurgy led to better weapons and tools, while advances in engineering made possible more sophisticated irrigation systems and defensive fortifications. The introduction of new crops and farming techniques, often learned from Chinese sources, helped increase agricultural productivity and support a growing population. The Kamakura period also saw significant developments in Japanese craft production and trade. The demand for weapons and armor created by the warrior government stimulated the development of metalworking industries, while the need for horses and military equipment encouraged trade with other regions of Asia. The ports of Kamakura and Hakata became centers of international commerce, with merchants from China, Korea, and Southeast Asia bringing goods to exchange for Japanese products. The muffled chatter in the markets now included foreign tongues, the smells of distant lands. The consolidation of warrior rule during the early Kamakura period was not without its challenges. The death of Yoritomo in 1199 led to a succession crisis that threatened to tear apart the fragile political structure he had created. The solution that emerged was the establishment of the HJ Regency, a system in which real power was exercised by hereditary ministers who served the nominally ruling shoguns. This arrangement, while effective in maintaining stability, also demonstrated the continued importance of behind-the-scenes political maneuvering in Japanese governance. The HJ regents proved to be skilled administrators who strengthened and refined the Kamakura system during their 2 centuries of rule. They established a network of provincial governors who were directly responsible to the shogunate, created a system of law courts that could resolve disputes efficiently, and developed administrative procedures that allowed for effective governance of a complex and diverse society. Under their leadership, the Kamakura shogunate reached its zenith of power and influence. Everyone's pretending they know what they're doing, but the Hojo actually did. The success of the HJ Regency was tested by the greatest external threat that medieval Japan would face: the Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281. These attacks, launched by Kublai Khan from his bases in China and Korea, represented the first serious attempt by a foreign power to conquer the Japanese archipelago. The Mongol forces that arrived on the shores of Kyushu were unlike anything the Japanese had previously encountered. Combining Chinese military technology with Mongol tactical innovation and Korean naval expertise, the quiet dread that permeated the air was now a palpable fear. The first invasion in 1274 caught the Japanese defenders off guard. The Mongol forces, numbering perhaps 30,000 men transported in over 900 ships, landed at Hakata Bay on the island of Kyushu and quickly established a beachhead. Their military tactics were fundamentally different from those employed by Japanese warriors, emphasizing mass formations, coordinated attacks, and the use of gunpowder weapons that had never before been seen in Japan. The explosive thuds and alien smells of gunpowder must have been terrifying. The Mongol army was a cosmopolitan force that reflected the vast extent of Kublai Khan's empire. Chinese engineers operated the catapults and siege engines that battered Japanese fortifications, while Mongol cavalry provided the shock troops that broke through defensive lines. Korean sailors navigated the treacherous waters around Kyushu, their knowledge of local tides and currents proving invaluable in landing operations. The diversity of the attacking force, with its multiple languages and military traditions, created logistical challenges but also provided tactical advantages that the Japanese found difficult to counter. The weapons employed by the Mongol forces were revolutionary by Japanese standards. The explosive shells fired by their catapults created terror among defenders who had never experienced the psychological impact of gunpowder weapons. The crossbows used by Chinese infantry could penetrate Japanese armor at ranges that made traditional archery ineffective. Most significantly, the Mongol emphasis on unit cohesion and coordinated tactics challenged the individual combat, traditions that had dominated Japanese warfare since the Genpei War. What seemed impossible eventually became the new normal, but not without struggle. The Japanese response to the Mongol threat revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their military system. The HJ regents quickly mobilized forces from across the archipelago, demonstrating the effectiveness of their administrative network and the loyalty of their vassals. Thousands of samurai converged on Kyushu, bringing with them the weapons and equipment that had been accumulated over generations of internal warfare. The sight of these warriors, with their distinctive armor and weapons, must have been impressive, even to enemies accustomed to the military spectacles of the Mongol Empire. Yet, the coordination of these forces proved difficult, as the individualistic warrior culture that had developed during the Kamakura period was not well suited to the demands of large-scale defensive operations. Samurai were accustomed to fighting in small groups under the direct leadership of their immediate lords, not as part of vast armies directed by distant commanders. The challenge of integrating forces from different regions, each with its own traditions and methods, created confusion and inefficiency that the Mongols were quick to exploit. The first Mongol invasion was ultimately repelled, though not entirely through Japanese military efforts. A typhoon struck the Mongol fleet as it lay at anchor off the Kyushu coast, sinking many ships and forcing the invaders to withdraw with heavy losses. This divine intervention, as it was perceived by the Japanese, was interpreted as evidence of the gods' protection of their sacred land. The concept of Japan as a divine country, protected by the KMI and blessed by the Buddha, was reinforced by this experience and would remain a powerful element in Japanese consciousness for centuries to come. The threat of a second invasion prompted the regents to undertake massive defensive preparations. Stone walls were built along the coastline where the Mongols were expected to land, creating fortified positions that could channel attacking forces into killing zones. These walls, some of which still stand today, were engineering marvels that required the coordinated labor of thousands of workers over several years. The construction effort demonstrated the organizational capabilities of the Kamakura government and the willingness of the Japanese people to sacrifice for the defense of their homeland. The military organization was reformed to emphasize collective defense rather than individual prowess, with samurai units trained to fight as coordinated formations. This represented a fundamental shift in Japanese military thinking, moving away from the heroic individual combat that had characterized the Genpei War toward the mass tactics that would dominate later periods. New weapons were developed or imported, including improved bows, crossbows, and the first primitive firearms that would eventually revolutionize Japanese warfare. The defensive preparations also included the construction of beacon fires and signal systems that could rapidly communicate news of an invasion to forces throughout Kyushu and beyond. These networks, stretching from coastal watchtowers to mountain peaks, allowed for coordination of defensive efforts across vast distances. The sight of smoke rising from these beacons during practice exercises must have been both reassuring and ominous, a reminder of the constant vigilance required to protect the islands from foreign invasion. The wind howling carried both hope and dread. The second Mongol invasion in 1281 was far larger than the first, with perhaps 140,000 men transported in two separate fleets that were to converge on Kyushu from different directions. The scale of this undertaking dwarfed any previous military operation in East Asian history, requiring the mobilization of resources from across the Mongol Empire. The invasion force included not only Mongol and Chinese troops, but also Korean sailors, Persian cavalry, and even some European mercenaries who had joined the Mongol armies during their westward expansion. The Japanese defenders, better prepared and more effectively organized than 7 years earlier, put up fierce resistance from behind their defensive walls. The fighting was brutal and prolonged, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage for several weeks. The samurai had learned from their previous encounter with Mongol tactics and adapted their fighting methods accordingly, using coordinated archery volleys and defensive formations that neutralized many of the invaders' advantages. Change sneaks in where no one notices, and these tactical shifts were profound. The siege warfare that characterized much of the 1281 invasion was unlike anything previously seen in Japan. The Mongol forces, equipped with sophisticated siege engines and explosive devices, pounded the Japanese fortifications, while samurai defenders replied with arrows and stones, the sound of the bombardment, echoing across the water from the beaches where the fighting raged, must have been audible for miles inland, a constant reminder of the life-and-death struggle taking place on the coast. Once again, however, natural forces intervened in the conflict. A massive typhoon, even more destructive than the storm of 1274, struck the Mongol fleet and destroyed much of the invasion force. The survivors, scattered across the waters around Kyushu, were systematically hunted down and killed by Japanese forces. This second divine wind, or kamikaze, was seen as even more conclusive proof of Japan's divine protection, creating a mythology of invincibility that would influence Japanese thinking about foreign threats for centuries to come. The successful defense against the Mongol invasions had profound consequences for Japanese society and culture. The warrior class, which had proven its worth in defending the homeland against the most powerful empire in the world, gained even greater prestige and authority. The experience of fighting against a technologically superior enemy had demonstrated the importance of adaptation and innovation, leading to improvements in military organization, fortification techniques, and weapons technology that would serve Japan well in future conflicts. The concept of Japan as a unique and sacred land, protected by divine forces, became deeply embedded in the national consciousness. This belief would later be expressed in the term Land of the Gods, Shinkoku*, reflecting the conviction that Japan occupied a special place in the cosmic order. The successful repulsion of the Mongol invasions became a foundational myth that would be evoked during times of crisis and foreign threat throughout Japanese history. Yet the victory over the Mongols also created new problems for the Kamakura shogunate. The enormous expense of the defensive preparations and the mobilization of forces from across the archipelago had strained the government's resources to the breaking point. Unlike previous conflicts, there were no conquered territories to distribute and no enemy wealth to plunder as rewards for the warriors who had risked their lives in defense of the homeland. The resulting financial crisis contributed to growing discontent among the warrior class and weakened the foundation of HJ rule. The economic disruption caused by the Mongol invasions extended far beyond the immediate costs of defense. The constant threat of attack had disrupted trade routes and agricultural production, particularly in western Japan, where the invasions had taken place. Many samurai had neglected their estates while serving in the defense forces, leading to reduced agricultural output and decreased tax revenues. The cumulative effect of these problems created a spiral of economic decline that the Kamakura government struggled to address. The smoldering embers of discontent were growing hotter. The cultural impact of the Mongol invasions was equally significant. The threat of foreign conquest had forced the Japanese to confront their own identity and values in new ways. The experience of fighting against enemies who did not share their cultural assumptions about warfare and honor had challenged traditional beliefs about the superiority of Japanese methods and values. At the same time, the ultimate victory had reinforced traditional beliefs about divine protection and cultural superiority, creating a complex legacy that would influence Japanese attitudes toward the outside world for generations. The period following the Mongol invasions saw the emergence of new forms of Buddhist practice that reflected the changing needs and concerns of Japanese society. The Nichiren school, founded by a charismatic monk who preached the exclusive veneration of the Lotus Sutra, appealed to those who sought a more activist and nationalistic form of Buddhism. Nichiren's teachings emphasized the special role of Japan in the Buddhist cosmos and the need for religious and political unity in the face of foreign threats. The various Pure Land schools continued to gain followers among both the warrior class and the common people, offering the promise of salvation through faith in Amida Buddha rather than through complex philosophical understanding or rigorous practice. These schools were particularly attractive to those who had witnessed the horrors of war and sought comfort in the promise of a peaceful afterlife. The asterisk Nembutsu asterisk, the simple invocation of Amida's name, could be recited even in the midst of battle, providing spiritual solace to warriors facing death. The artistic achievements of the late Kamakura period reflected the influence of both traditional court culture and the emerging warrior aesthetic. Sculpture reached new heights of realism and emotional expression, with artists creating works that combined technical mastery with deep spiritual feeling. The famous wooden statues of the period, such as the guardian figures at Todaji-la, displayed a dynamic energy and psychological intensity that reflected the turbulent times in which they were created. The tradition of narrative painting, which had flourished during the Heian period, was adapted to celebrate the military achievements of the warrior class. Scroll paintings depicting famous battles and heroic deeds became popular forms of art that served both aesthetic and propagandistic purposes. These works often combined realistic depictions of warfare with supernatural elements, reflecting the Buddhist and Shinto beliefs that shaped Japanese understanding of military conflict. The literary culture of the late Kamakura period was dominated by war tales and historical narratives that celebrated the deeds of famous warriors. The asterisk hike, Monogatari asterisk, or Tale of the Hike, became the most famous of these works, recounting the rise and fall of the Taira clan with a poetic beauty that transformed historical events into timeless art. These narratives were not merely entertainment, but served important social functions, preserving the memory of past events and transmitting the values and ideals of the warrior class to future generations. The performance traditions that emerged during this period reflected the growing importance of oral culture in warrior society. Professional storytellers, known as biwa hoshi, because they accompanied their tales with music played on the asterisk biwa asterisk lute, traveled throughout Japan, recounting the great events of the Genpei War and other military conflicts. These performances, often given in the courtyards of temples or the halls of warrior residences, created a shared cultural memory that helped define Japanese identity. The economic changes of the late Kamakura period laid the foundation for many of the developments that would characterize later Japanese history. The growth of interregional trade, stimulated by the military government's need for resources and equipment, led to the development of new commercial networks and the emergence of a merchant class. Markets began to appear in temple precincts and castle towns, creating centers of economic activity that would eventually challenge the agricultural basis of medieval society. The increasing monetization of the economy, driven by the need to pay for military expenses and administrative costs, began to transform social relationships and challenge traditional patterns of authority. Chinese copper coins, imported through trade, became the standard medium of exchange, replacing the barter systems that had previously dominated local commerce. This shift toward a money economy created new opportunities for economic advancement, but also increased economic inequality and social tension. Catastrophe forces opportunity, creating winners and losers. The position of women in late Kamakura society reflected the changing nature of warrior culture and the increasing emphasis on military values. Among the warrior elite, women's rights to inherit property and military positions became more restricted as the system of primogeniture was strengthened to maintain the coherence of military units. However, women continued to play important roles in estate management and cultural life, and some achieved positions of considerable influence through their connections to powerful men. The education of women from samurai families emphasized both cultural accomplishments and practical skills. They were expected to be proficient in poetry, calligraphy, and music, but they were also taught to manage households, supervise servants, and defend their homes when necessary. The ideal samurai woman was one who could maintain the cultural traditions of her family while also providing practical support for her husband's military career. The grainy wood of the loom, the cool metal of the kitchen knife, their tools were different, but their strength was undeniable. The decline of the Kamakura shogunate began in the early 14th century, as the financial strains of the Mongol defense combined with other factors to weaken the HJ Regency. The system of rewards and obligations that had held the warrior class together for over a century began to break down as economic pressures mounted and traditional loyalties were tested by changing circumstances. The emergence of powerful regional lords who could challenge the authority of the central government created new sources of instability and conflict. The growing sophistication of regional administration meant that local lords were increasingly capable of governing their territories without reference to central authority. Many had developed their own administrative systems, legal codes, and military forces that made them virtually independent rulers within their domains. This process of decentralization, while it provided effective local governance, also undermined the unity that had been the Kamakura system's greatest strength. The heavy silence of central authority was being replaced by the muffled chatter of local power. The final crisis of the Kamakura period came in the form of a succession dispute within the imperial family that provided the spark for widespread rebellion against HJ rule. Emperor Go-Daigo, who had been forced to abdicate in favor of a rival claimant supported by the HJ regents, began to organize resistance with the support of disaffected warriors and religious leaders. The emperor's appeal to restore direct imperial rule found support among those who had grown tired of HJ dominance and those who hoped to benefit from a change in government. The resulting conflict, known as the Genko War, began in 1331 and would ultimately lead to the fall of the Kamakura shogunate and the establishment of a new political order. The war was characterized by shifting alliances and complex political maneuvering as various factions sought to position themselves advantageously in the emerging new order. The most significant defection came when Ashikaga Takauji, a powerful eastern lord who had initially supported the HJ, switched sides and led his forces against Kamakura itself. The fall of Kamakura in 1333 marked the end of Japan's first warrior government and the beginning of a period of political experimentation that would ultimately lead to the establishment of the Ashikaga shogunate. The destruction of the city, with its temples, palaces, and administrative buildings symbolized the passing of an era and the beginning of something entirely new. The HJ regents, faced with inevitable defeat, chose to die by their own hands rather than submit to their enemies, following the warrior code that they had helped to define. The Kenmu Restoration of 1333 represented an attempt to restore direct imperial rule after more than a century of warrior government. Emperor Go-Daigo, supported by military leaders like Ashikaga Takauji and Nita Yoshisada, succeeded in overthrowing the HJ Regency and establishing a new government based in Kyoto. The restoration was motivated by a complex mixture of political ambition, religious idealism, and nostalgia for the classical imperial system of the Nara and Heian periods. The new government attempted to implement a series of reforms that would have fundamentally transformed Japanese society. The emperor and his advisors sought to centralize administrative authority, reduce the power of the warrior class, and revive the cultural traditions of the imperial court. Land grants were to be redistributed according to merit rather than hereditary privilege, and a new system of governance was to be established that would combine ancient wisdom with contemporary needs. The Restoration government's policies reflected a sophisticated understanding of the problems that had led to the decline of the Kamakura system. Efforts were made to reform the tax system, improve agricultural productivity, and reduce the burden of military service on the peasantry. New schools were established to educate administrators in classical Chinese learning, and attempts were made to revive the court ceremonies and cultural practices that had been neglected during the warrior period. Yet the Kenmu Restoration was ultimately doomed by the same forces that had brought it to power. The warrior class, which had supported the overthrow of the HJ Regency, was not willing to surrender the privileges and authority it had accumulated over 2 centuries of military rule. The economic and social changes that had occurred during the Kamakura period could not be easily reversed, and the attempt to restore imperial authority faced opposition from entrenched interests throughout Japanese society. The most serious challenge to the restoration came from Ashikaga Takauji, one of the military leaders who had initially supported Emperor Go-Daigo. Takauji, who had expected to be rewarded for his service with a position of high authority in the new government, became disillusioned with the emperor's policies and began to organize opposition to imperial rule. The conflict between the emperor and his former ally would ultimately lead to the establishment of the Ashikaga shogunate and the beginning of a new era in Japanese history. The break between Go-Daigo and Takuji was not simply a matter of personal ambition, but reflected fundamental disagreements about the nature of governance and the role of the military in Japanese society. The emperor envisioned a return to the classical system, in which civilian officials educated in Chinese learning and responsible only to the throne would administer the country according to Confucian principles of benevolent government. Takauji and his supporters, by contrast, believed that political authority must ultimately rest on military power, and that the warrior class had earned the right to rule through its service in defending the country. The civil war that erupted in 1336 between the supporters of Go-Daigo and those of Takauji was more complex and devastating than the conflicts that had brought down the Kamakura system. Both sides commanded significant military resources and had legitimate claims to political authority, creating a situation in which neither could achieve quick victory. The fighting spread throughout the archipelago, drawing in regional lords who saw opportunities to advance their own interests in the chaos of civil conflict. Barren farmland and scattered settlements spoke of the destruction. The establishment of the Ashikaga shogunate in 1338 marked the beginning of a new phase in Japanese political development. Unlike the Kamakura system, which had maintained a clear separation between the imperial court in Kyoto and the military government in Kamakura, the new shogunate was based in Kyoto itself, in the Miramachi district that would give its name to the entire period. This proximity to the imperial court created opportunities for cultural synthesis, but also increased the potential for political conflict. The Ashikaga period, which lasted from 1338 to 1573, was characterized by both cultural flowering and political instability. The new shoguns attempted to combine the military authority of the Kamakura system with the cultural sophistication of the imperial court, creating a unique political and cultural environment that would produce some of the greatest achievements in Japanese art and literature. Yet this synthesis was always fragile, undermined by the competing claims of imperial and military authority and the centrifugal forces that pulled regional lords away from central control. The early Ashikaga shoguns were great patrons of the arts, supporting the development of new forms of artistic expression that reflected the changing nature of Japanese society. The un-theater, which emerged during this period under the patronage of Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, combined elements of dance, music, and poetry into a sophisticated, dramatic form that would influence Japanese culture for centuries. The plays, often based on classical literature or historical events, were performed on simple stages with minimal scenery, relying on the skill of the actors and the imagination of the audience to create their effects. The development of un-theater reflected the aesthetic preferences of the Ashikaga court, which favored subtlety and suggestion over direct representation. The masked actors moved with stylized gestures that conveyed emotion through restraint and understatement, their performances guided by principles of or meaningful silence that created space for contemplation and reflection. The audiences for these performances were typically members of the warrior elite and the imperial court, who possessed the cultural knowledge necessary to appreciate the complex literary and historical allusions embedded in the plays. The aesthetic philosophy that emerged during the Ashikaga period emphasized the beauty of imperfection and impermanence, concepts that were deeply rooted in Buddhist teaching but found new expression in Japanese art and culture. This philosophy, later known as *WABI-SABI*, celebrated the natural processes of aging and decay, finding beauty in rust, weathering, and asymmetry. It represented a distinctly Japanese adaptation of Buddhist concepts about the transient nature of existence. Handmade pottery, cool to the touch, often embodied this understated beauty. The tea ceremony, which reached its mature form during this period, embodied many of these aesthetic and philosophical principles. What had begun as a simple method of preparing and serving tea was transformed by Japanese practitioners into a complex ritual that emphasized harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. The ceremony took place in specially designed rooms that reflected the principles of *WABI-SABI*, with rough textured walls, asymmetrical arrangements, and natural materials that showed the marks of age and use. The tea master became a figure of great cultural importance, someone who could guide participants through the complex choreography of the ceremony and help them achieve a state of spiritual calm. The most famous of these masters was Senno Rikyei, who served the military leaders. Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi and elevated the tea ceremony to the level of high art. His emphasis on simplicity and naturalness influenced not only the tea ceremony but Japanese aesthetics more generally. The architectural achievements of the Ashikaga period reflected the synthesis of warrior and court cultures that characterized the era. The Golden Pavilion, or Kinkakaji, built by Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu in the late 14th century, exemplified this aesthetic fusion. The building's 3 stories represented different architectural styles, from the simple warrior residence of the first floor to the elaborate aristocratic design of the second floor to the Zen temple architecture of the third floor. The entire structure was covered in gold leaf and reflected in the surrounding pond, creating an image of ethereal beauty that seemed to float between earth and sky. The gardens that surrounded buildings like the Golden Pavilion were works of art in themselves, carefully designed landscapes that combined natural and artificial elements into harmonious compositions. These gardens were not mere decorative spaces, but philosophical statements about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. They incorporated principles of asymmetry, borrowed scenery, and seasonal change that reflected the Buddhist understanding of impermanence and the Shinto reverence for natural forces. The famous rock garden of Rionji, created during the late 15th century, represents the ultimate expression of this garden aesthetic. The garden consists of 15 carefully arranged stones set in a bed of raked white gravel, with no trees, flowers, or water to distract from the essential relationship between stone and space. The arrangement is designed so that no matter where the viewer stands, at least one stone is always hidden from view, creating a sense of incompleteness that invites contemplation and reflection. The cultural achievements of the early Ashikaga period were made possible by the political stability and economic prosperity that characterized the first century of the new shogunate. The Ashikaga shoguns succeeded in maintaining a delicate balance between the various factions within the warrior class, using a combination of military strength, diplomatic skill, and cultural patronage to maintain their authority. The system of provincial governors that they established allowed for effective local administration while maintaining central control over key resources and strategic locations. The economic foundation of Ashikaga rule was based on the continued development of agriculture and the significant growth of interregional trade. The shogunate actively promoted commercial activity, recognizing that economic prosperity was essential for political stability. New markets were established in major cities. Roads and waterways were improved to facilitate transportation, and standardized weights and measures were introduced to reduce transaction costs. The result was a period of unprecedented economic growth that benefited all levels of society. The growth of trade during the Ashikaga period was facilitated by improvements in transportation and communication. New roads were built, connecting major cities and castle towns, while existing routes were improved with better bridges and rest stations. The development of a system of official messengers allowed for rapid communication across long distances, enabling the coordination of commercial and political activities on a national scale. Thriving new settlements emerged along these routes, their rooftops huddled like sleepy animals. The emergence of a merchant class during this period represented a significant social development that would have lasting consequences for Japanese society. These merchants, many of whom had begun as small traders serving local markets, gradually expanded their operations to encompass regional and even international trade. Some became wealthy enough to challenge the traditional supremacy of the warrior and court classes, using their economic power to gain political influence and social recognition. Entrepreneurial ambition was on the rise. The religious landscape of the Ashikaga period was characterized by both continuity and innovation. The established Buddhist schools continued to maintain their influence, particularly among the elite classes, while new forms of popular Buddhism emerged that appealed to ordinary people. The Zen tradition, which had been introduced during the Kamakura period, reached its full flowering under Ashikaga patronage, with great masters developing new approaches to meditation and enlightenment that would influence Japanese culture for centuries.